Once again, the Philistines were battling the Israelites. The Philistines had camped upon one hill and the Israelites upon the other, and the valley of Elah ran between them. Now every morning, both armies would dress in all of their battle gear, and they would come out in formation staring at each other. But the Philistines had a giant of a warrior. His name was Goliath. He stood 9 feet 9 inches tall. He wore a helmet and a breastplate made of bronze, and he carried a bronze javelin, and his shield bearer walked before him. And every morning Goliath would break through the ranks of the Philistines and stand and stare at the army of Israel. And he would say, "Why have you dressed your whole army? Send one man to battle me. If he defeats me, the Philistines will bow before you and be your servants. But if I defeat him, then Israel will become the slaves of the Philistines, but the battle will be over." Now the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul into this war. And so Jesse called David to come, and he said, "I want you to take these provisions and go to the battlefront. Talk with your brothers, and then return to me and give me good news about my sons." So early the next day, David took the provisions that his father had gathered, and he went to the battlefront. When he arrived, he saw both armies in formation, and he heard yelling and shouting, and quickly he handed the provisions to the quartermaster and went to find his brothers. And then he saw Goliath, and he heard Goliath, "Send one man to fight me." And then David saw all the army turned away from Goliath in fear. David said, "Why are you turning away from this Philistine? Who does he think he is to defy the living God of Israel? What will Saul do for the man who fights him?" And the soldiers said, "Have you looked at this man? Saul has said that whoever defeats him, he will make that soldier rich. His family will pay no taxes. Saul will even give his daughter's hand in marriage." Now Eliab heard David yelling, and it angered him. He came to his brother and he said, "Why are you here with your conceited heart? Have you come to watch a few battles? Go back to your few sheep, because war is for men." But David said, "I've done nothing wrong. I'm asking questions." And he turned back to the army and he said, "Who will fight this ungodly Philistine?" Now Saul heard David yelling, and he asked for David to come to his tent. David walked in and bowed before the king, and he said, "Don't fear this Philistine. I am your servant, and I'll fight him." Saul looked at David and he said, "No, Goliath is a trained warrior. He's been fighting in battle since he was a child. You're but a boy." David said, "You don't understand. I work as a shepherd for my father, and sometimes a bear or a lion comes down from the hills and attacks my flock. I go after that animal and I knock it down and save the lamb from its jaws. And if that bear or that lion is to turn on me, I grab them by the beard and knock them down and kill them. This Philistine, he is nothing more than another beast to be slain." Eventually, Saul agreed to let David fight. He gave David all of his armor and his own sword, and David put the armor on and he put the sword by his waist, and he walked about the tent, but it was clumsy and cumbersome. He said, I cannot fight like this." And so he took off all the armor, picked up his shepherd's staff, and went down to the brook, where he collected 5 smooth stones. And then, dressed like a shepherd, David went out to battle Goliath. Goliath saw him coming, and he saw that David was young and healthy and handsome, and he despised David. He said, "What? Do you think that I'm a dog that you send this stick to beat me? Come, I'll chop off your head and feed it to the birds of the air." But David stood firm. He said, "You come at me with sword and spear and lance. I come at you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the army of Israel. And on this day, it is I who will chop off your head. On this day, I will feed the carcasses of the Philistines to the birds of the air. And on this day, all the world will know that there is one true God in Israel. Anyone watching this battle will know this battle is the Lord's, and he'll deliver you to me." Goliath began to lumber toward David, and David ran full force toward the giant. He pulled a stone from his pouch and put it into the sling, and he began to twirl that over his head. And then with deadly accuracy, he let the stone fly, and it embedded in Goliath's forehead. The giant tottered a bit and fell face first into the dirt. David ran up to him, and using Goliath's own sword, he chopped off the giant's head and then held it aloft in victory. When the Philistines saw their warrior defeated, they turned and ran for the gates of Gath. The Israelites gave out a cheer of victory and took off after them. Many Philistines died that day by the swords of Israel. Now Saul asked his commander Abner, "Who is this man?" And Abner admitted that he didn't know. And so David was brought back to Saul's tent. He walked in carrying the bloody head of Goliath. Saul looked at him and said, "Who are you?" And he replied, "I am David, the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem."